Good morning, everyone. Please take a seat and settle down. Welcome to everyone, to those here in Kiviets Kroon and also to those online joining us again for day 2 of our early grade reading research in Indaba. We had a really good day yesterday, a lot of vibrant discussions, wonderful to interact with everyone and to see everyone again. Today we have an interesting program lined up. This morning we have a session around technology and learning loss and parents. So we have I think 4 presentations and then a panel with those who presented. So first up we'll have Professor Martin Gustafsson from the DBE presenting on some of what we've done on the learning losses, the measurement of the impact of the pandemic on early grade reading in particular. Then Ms. Kolosa Nonkenge, also from the department, will present on a bit more detail on the EGRS 2 intervention, which used virtual coaching and reflecting on the use of technology in that intervention. Then we have our second international speaker who has come out to join us, Dr. Gnome Angriest, and he's also going to do a presentation on a technology intervention during COVID, and with some interesting results there. Then we'll have Ms. Sibongile Kumalo from the Learning Trust speaking to us about some parental involvement work that they've been doing, to get another perspective on some of the outside of school support structures that there are. And then we're going to have a panel discussion discussing the role of parents and not just parents but caregivers more broadly, as well as the role of technology in supporting learning. So that's the lineup for this morning, for the first session. With that, let me call Martin up to present to us on the impact of the pandemic. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Stephen. Morning, everyone. So, learning losses during COVID. Thank you. Okay. So I'm Martin Gustafsson. I'm based much of the time at the Department of Basic Education. I'm also with University of Stellenbosch. And what I'm going to talk about is what we know about the learning losses, but then also other related issues. How do our losses compare historically and globally? Why we had learning losses in the first place, and then something about the evolving and quite confusing picture of school participation during the pandemic. And then, because technology is part of is within the topic of this panel, I've just kind of added a slide on just some statistics on technology access in primary schools. So I could spend my entire time on this slide. What I've done here is to summarize the 3 main sources of knowledge we have about the learning losses. This is amazing work. Ardington et al. Is in bold because it's in a peer-reviewed journal. And what we know in red there, you see that in the first 2 analyses, we have 57 to 70%, 62 to 81% of a year's worth of learning lost as a result of the pandemic. This is a higher 130% in the 3rd study because it covers a longer period of time. It goes up to term 3 of 2021. All of this is based on EGRS type oral reading fluency testing, and comparisons a group that lost learning compared to a group that was not affected by the pandemic and therefore did not lose learning. So we know quite a lot, but there's also a lot we don't know. I mean, these are 500 schools that we have, these analyses are based on. We have 16,000 schools offering grade 1 in the public system. All of these studies focused on schools that are not middle-class schools, so we don't really know what happened in middle-class schools. And of course, they're in specific areas, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, and Northwest. But we can assume that similar learning losses have occurred across the system, and what we are most concerned about is the schools not of the middle class, but of the majority of South Africans. So then, let me move on to, so what can we expect to find out going forward? What new information is coming? The systemic evaluation, which is sample-based and collected data from grades 3, 6, and 9 in 2021, will have its results released in February of 2023. That's the official kind of commitment. That's going to be interesting in terms of just knowing what learners can and can't do. It's a very important national assessment. However, it paused for over a decade, so we don't have anything to compare it to just immediately before the pandemic. However, going forward, and it's supposed to be collecting information, I think it's every second year, it will give us some idea of how quickly we are moving up and going back to the trajectory of improvement that we had before the pandemic. At the end of this year, Pearls 2021 results are going to be released. This is going to be really important to understand what the impact of the pandemic has been on this improvement that we've seen over time. We have seen improvement over time. This is well documented. A lot of people are confused, understandably, because information has been moving around. The trajectory is that black curve that you see. It was changed because of a problem with the 2011 results that the IEA has now corrected. So we saw an improvement. In fact, the improvement in the previous 2011 to 2016 period was the second steepest of all countries that participated. We were second after Morocco. So the system is capable of improving, right? And I think that's important to understand. And what we don't really know is what brought about these improvements. And it's very difficult, just from a research angle, to understand what lies behind this. But clearly, I mean, Stephen and myself have done some work, and using the Pearls data, it seems as if it's not just changes in the schooling system, and there were changes in the schooling system. There were workbooks, there was CAPS. A lot of the change seems to be driven by changes in the household. So in other words, more educated adults in the household, better access to technologies in the household. So one should not think that all improvement occurs because of what happens in school. What happens in school is important, but it's obviously complemented by what happens at home. Where are we going to go going forward? That's the little red arrow. It's anyone's guess what's going to come out at the end of this year. I think if our results are the same as they were back in 2016, we should be pretty happy. We're not going to see that improvement trajectory continue. Almost certainly we're not, because of the pandemic. But this is obviously something to watch out for. What are those results at the end of the year? That's really going to give us a pretty good national picture of how the pandemic hit us. Right. Now, the systemic evaluation, I think, brings up two important issues that those of us who want to improve early grade reading should be thinking about. The one is that, you know, I think people in this meeting are people who are very inclined towards EGRS type testing, interventions, evaluations of interventions. There are different kind of approaches to these problems. I mean, the assessment specialists in the system tend to be more interested in pencil and paper type tests, which is what the systemic evaluation has and what PEARLS does. And there's some tension around here that all of these tests cost money. And there's some contestation at a budget level around which direction to take. So I think one needs to keep this in mind, and you know, one needs to be very clear about what the benefits and costs are of different types of testing. The other thing that the systemic evaluation brings up is that, you know, in some ways, it's been introduced to replace the annual national assessments, which were universal, covered all schools. There's been general agreement amongst all stakeholders, including government, that the annual national assessments were very problematic. They were not well designed. The policy basis was very weak. But, of course, the systemic evaluation, being sample-based, is not going to give us information about all schools in the country in the way that ANA did. ANA was not a very good measure of what was happening, but it did cover all schools. So I think what we need to bear in mind is that we don't have a universal system at the primary level that can tell us, for example, in these schools, reading is really, really poor. And we need to talk to the principal. We need to do something. That kind of measurement we don't have. We have an enormous amount of school-based assessment data. We have the partnership with the Dell Foundation. Masses of data are available through their portal that schools, principals, and districts can access. However, it's not standardized. So it can't be used to say, all right, this school is problematic. That school may have weak results simply because they do testing very well. So the question then is, you know, to what extent can one try and improve the school-based assessment results so that they can be used for some kind of purpose, management purpose, and accountability purpose? These are issues that I think are hanging there. Right, I'm halfway through my time. The historical and global context. So we lost learning as a result of the pandemic. The learning we've lost equals about 5 years of historical progress. So the pandemic pushed us back 5 years. But that doesn't mean that we need to take 5 years to get back to where we were. It will take time, but probably not 5 years. Partly because this is not, you know, we are bringing in new children into the system, and you know, our grade 4s in 2024 will have less kind of damage as a result of the pandemic than, say, children who were in grade 2 in 2019. That's a really bad cohort to be in, to have been starting school just as the pandemic started. So they're going to be very cohort-specific effects. A ray of hope is, or of light is the fact that our data are relatively good. The Center for Global Development released a report early this year. They tried to bring together what studies exist on learning losses and on dropout rates during the pandemic. And we're quite well represented in that report. There are many other middle-income countries that have much worse or much less information than we have. So we have information that can guide us. This is from a UNESCO report. Our losses are about comparable to what is seen in other countries. In fact, our losses are not as bad at the primary level as those of Brazil. Why did learning losses happen? A lot of the emphasis has understandably been on losses in contact time. That is obviously important. But there are other issues as well. Of course, economic and social trauma in the household, the very problematic socioeconomic situation we're in currently has an impact on what happens in schools. We have children who are hungry, who are stunted, and this impacts on learning. Teacher deaths, almost 1% of teachers lost their lives during the pandemic. Obviously, that has all sorts of, psychological and logistical implications. Then moving on to school participation, the first bar is before the pandemic. Children were attending nearly all the time. That little red bit is regular absenteeism, children being ill, just not coming to school, relatively low. And we know this from various sources. The second bar is what happened in 2020. So the orange then is absenteeism because you were not allowed to attend school, either because the entire system was closed or because there was rotational learning at schools. Then the third bar is what we know from data from term 3 of 2021. This is now published on the DBE website. And there we know that by term 3 of 2021, the kind of obligatory losses, time when you could not attend school, was reduced substantially. That's the orange bit. But it's very unequal. So some learners by the end of 2021 were still experiencing rotational timetabling, others were not. So for the worst 1/3, it was bad still by the end of 2021. Currently, the data suggest that it's only in isolated instances that schools are forcing some learners to stay at home, others to come. This is also from a recently released DBE report. And this is where some of the confusion comes in, that, surprisingly, as I say there, surprisingly overall participation in the sense of some engagement with the school increased during the pandemic. It did not decline. This is not what was expected, all right? We expected dropping out to worsen quite badly. And it did worsen a bit, but not to the extent that we thought or has been reported according to NIDS-CRAM. So the green is, who was entering the system before the pandemic. Most children enter grade R, but there are some children who enter straight into grade 1, right? So before the pandemic, that was the situation, approximately 1 million children. That declined during the pandemic. So this was not a question of dropping out. This was a question of households not sending their children to school as they would have before the pandemic. So delaying first entry into school. That accounts for about a loss of 27,000. There are 27,000 children who we should have had in 2021 who were still kept at home. That's a problem. But it's not like 500,000. Then the first red-yellow bar is before the pandemic, who was leaving the school every year. It was about half were people who were matriculants, and most of those had the NSC. Some just had the statement of results. And then the yellow is those who leave school every year with no NSC. All right. We thought we were going to see what's in that very last bar. We thought the second last one. Initial fears was that dropping out was going to increase substantially. We didn't think that we were going to get more matriculants. The NIDS-CRAM report came out with this finding that there were 500,000 dropouts, and that's what we feared. It turned out to be the opposite in a way. So the very last bar shows that, number one, we had more matrics than ever before in 2021, and this is largely because of the way promotion occurred between grade 11 and grade 12. The rules were changed. So this is probably a temporary kind of surge. It can't be, it probably won't be sustained like this for many years. But in addition, dropping out in grades 9, 10, 11 was lower than we expected. And this is probably partly because there were just fewer employment opportunities out of school, so people just stayed on in school. So there was some dropping out at the primary level. I've got a figure there, 19,000 dropped out of school, and that is obviously problematic. But, I mean, even the authors of the NIDS-CRAM analysis have kind of concluded that this was probably extended absenteeism, this 500,000. All right, I've got 2 minutes left. The increase in enrollments at the secondary level is not something that was only caused by the pandemic or associated with the pandemic. It started just before the pandemic. Between 2018 and 2019, there was this jump, and it continued. So there's just been this continuous increase in secondary enrollments, and that has implications for the primary level. Obviously, people will ask, is this real? And there have been a lot of checks as to whether this is real. Attendance data has been compared to enrollment data. These are two different data sources. Enrollment data is linked to resourcing, and attendance data is not. And the two agree with each other to a large extent. I'm almost done. Moving to issues of budgets, because if we're going to have an impact at the primary level, it obviously has costs. As a whole, the system is prioritizing post-school education. Spending per university student is going up. It's not going up at the school level. In addition, within the schooling system, and that's the bottom graph, secondary enrollments are going up, primary enrollments are not going up. What does that mean? With limited budgets, and we have limited budgets now, teaching posts are going to go to secondary school and away from primary school, unless one changes that distribution model. So there are risks in the primary level that, for instance, the problem of large class sizes is not going to be addressed quickly. And then my last slide. Technologies in South African primary schools. Okay, let me go through this just very quickly. This was an add-on just because of the theme of the panel. So what we've seen is rapid improvements outside schools. Access to the internet improved by 56% in households between 2007 and 2017. Progress in schools has actually been slower than progress outside schools. According to the School Monitoring Survey of 2017, you have those figures, 72, 66, 36% of principals, teachers, learners were accessing the internet at school. So a third of learners were accessing the internet in primary schools. TIMS and the School Monitoring Survey show that about half of learners are accessing computers or tablets at school. And here one of the tensions is between the more traditional computer lab, which accounts for most of this access, and kind of more kind of new ideas around individual devices and so on. And I think one thing one needs to acknowledge is that we just don't have a lot of research and policy direction on what route to follow. A lot of these computer labs have been set up by schools themselves. And this is currently what most of the technology access consists of in schools. And then the final bullet, so according to Thales, 20% of lower secondary teachers reported having participated in online training. That's quite low. So in other developing countries, the figures were better in Thales. So South African teachers currently are not very accustomed to being trained online. The survey covered lower secondary, but it's probably worse at the primary level. So insofar as one wants to use technology to train teachers in new methods, one needs to just accept that one also then needs to familiarize the system and teachers with this medium of training. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Next up will be Kolosa to come present on EGRS 2 and the use of technology in that intervention. Just to note that you'll have to be patient for Q&A all the way until after the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I will be presenting on the use of technology for reading outcomes, and as Stephen said, this is based on our EGRS 2 study in Mpumalanga province that was in the Hlanzeni and Gert Sibande districts. The EGRS 2 consisted of 2 interventions, and it had an on-site treatment arm and a virtual treatment arm. The on-site treatment arm included paper-based lesson plans and on-site coaching, and the virtual treatment arm, as suggested by the name, included tablets with electronic lesson plans and virtual coaching. And these interventions were from 2017 to 2019 in grades 1, 2, and 3. So the differences between the 2 interventions that I have just mentioned in the previous slide was that the on-site ones were paper-based and electronic, and the electronic versions had training videos, sound clips, and examples of exercises on the tablets so that the teachers would be able to refer to them when teaching in class. The on-site coaching consisted of in-person monthly visits by the coach, and the virtual coaching consisted of calls every 2 weeks, weekly text messages, and competitions using the tablet and platforms such as WhatsApp. And then with training, on-site coaches had a 2-day initial training, and the virtual coaching had 3 days, a 3-day initial training, so that's an added day for the virtual intervention. The EGRS 2 design included detailed lesson plans, integrated LTSM, and instructional coaching and training. Just to define what coaching is, I've put up here who coaches are and what coaching is. Coaches are people who are usually teachers who have taught in the foundation phase and sometimes have HOD level experience, who are then experts who received ongoing training through EGRS 2 to conduct the coaches in the schools with the teachers. And coaching is a strategy that we use to impact teachers' instructional practices and to positively impact learning outcomes. So our virtual coaching theory of change was based on these 4 points, and these were providing an alternative model of material delivery and capacity building virtually, and also accountability through monitoring of the coaches' activities on the tablets that they used, and also the incentives that were loaded on the tablets and could be accessed virtually to encourage the teachers to use the tablets and to interact with their virtual coach, even though they could not see them face to face. So our assumptions going into this were that virtual coaching might have been less effective in environments with limited technological penetration. Our assumption was also the age of most teachers in the foundation phase, noting that the teacher cohort was 40 years plus and may not be as technologically fluid and able to use the technology in the form of the tablets. And also Another assumption was on program implementation, fidelity, and technological failures, and those were reasons that we thought maybe virtual coaching would be less effective. However, when we looked at teacher attendance for virtual and on-site coaching, we noted that there was high teacher attendance at trainings, averaging at more than 90% training attendance for all teachers. And we note that SMTs who were also trained attended the trainings every term with the teachers to also get a feel of the program and to encourage fidelity and implementation in the schools. This graph shows that technology shows how teachers were using the technology. As we can see, teachers were able to access the materials that were on their tablets. From week 1, we see that there was quite a high access rate, and then in week 7, we see that a lot of teachers were accessing materials off of their tablets. So using the technology was not a problem for the teachers as we had previously assumed, and especially in week 7, which is usually assessment week, teachers were using the tablets a lot. Just a quick breakdown of the costs of on-site and virtual coaching. As we know, virtual coaching is thought to be a more cost-effective way of implementing coaching in schools that need it. But we can see here, if we look at the percentage total at the bottom, that virtual coaching was cheaper, but it was 90% cheaper than on-site coaching. So in terms of cost effectiveness, we can state that there is an argument that can be made that it is cheaper, but not much cheaper than on-site coaching. So I'm going to talk about the challenges and some of the solutions that we faced when implementing virtual coaching. So some of the challenges that came up was keeping the tablets functional, troubleshooting network and data issues, and ensuring that devices were virus-free. And to solve this problem, our coaches provided IT troubleshooting solutions and support to teachers. And in order to encourage virtual WhatsApp engagement, the WhatsApp chat conversations were directed in the same way that the phone calls were directed in order to discuss progress with lesson plans, and followed by 2 specific pedagogy questions, so that the teachers were able to, so that the coaches were able to keep the teachers accountable and ensure that they were implementing the coaching even virtually as they should. So some of the other challenges for using technology for reading outcomes included the limited means of communication that made it harder to build relationships of trust. And here it was the face-to-face interaction that lacked in virtual coaching, whereas the teachers only had phone calls and WhatsApp and were not seeing their teachers face-to-face except at training. And the virtual coaches themselves could not observe the teachers teaching in the classroom directly. So even though they would send videos or they would report, the coaches were not there, and that was a big challenge. And so this also led to weak accountability due to lack of in-person interaction, and coaches depended on whatever information that the teachers were willing to volunteer to them virtually. And then here on the screen, I have an example from a case study that was done with teachers who were who received in-person coaches, and these were some of their comments when it came to their relationship with the coaches who would come to their schools. When we read the first comment, we see that it shows that the positive reinforcement was really encouraging for the teachers, in that the coaches were able to tell them that they see improvement in their coaching, and just to have that encouraging voice, and the teachers knew that they were improving in what they were implementing. And we also see in the second box that it also helped methodology of teachers knowing how to teach phonics. And before, like the teacher was saying here, that they only had the DBE workbook, but now with the coaches, they had someone there to help them along with the methods of teaching in the classroom. So that the intervention should be cost effective for teachers and ensure data provision so that teachers are always able to access information. And this is also on platforms such as WhatsApp, where the teachers communicated with the coaches a lot. So ensuring that the communication does not stop because there's no data. And the virtual coaches also noted that relationship building is key, and that building these relationships virtually takes time, and that should be recognized as one of the barriers to, not that it's impossible, but then it will take longer than having an in-person coach. So the reading outcomes that were gleaned from the study is that by the end of year one, both virtual and on-site coaching was effective at improving English oral language proficiency, and after 3 years, only on-site coaching was more effective at improving English reading proficiency relative to the virtual coaching. And the virtual coaching program in the end had no impact on English reading proficiency and therefore reduced home language reading proficiency. And this could be due to the fact that teachers were then focusing on EFL because that was the language of that was the implementation for the program and not necessarily home language. So home language fell by the wayside. And in conclusion, I think that technology can work, it does work, but teachers need to engage with the virtual coach and receive more targeted feedback, and that smart educational technology solutions need to consider incentives that will motivate the users, in this case, the teachers, to use new technology. And I think overall is just the aspect of human contact and relationship building, and that it will take time, and maybe perhaps with time and technological advances technology can bridge that gap, but for now, we see that there is more engagement that is needed in order for this to be more successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalosa. All right, we now move on to Dr. Gnome Angriest. So while you come up, let me introduce you, Gnome. So we're very excited to have Gnome all the way out to South Africa and with us in person to present. Gnome is both an accomplished academic, but also a social entrepreneur, and he's received awards for some of his work in that area, and in particular is the CEO of Youth Impact. And he may tell us a bit more about what that's about as he tells us about a particular study that gained quite a bit of attention during the pandemic in the context of Botswana. So Gnome, over to you. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. And we've been hearing about learning losses and some tech that didn't work. I'm going to give a shred of hope today. So putting that in context, a lot of technology doesn't work, but I'm going to give you some good news. So as Stephen said, I wear a few hats. I'm the CEO, Executive Director of Youth Impact, which is an NGO that scales up evidence-based programs in health and education. So I'll share a bit about that. I've also done some work with the World Bank on the Human Capital Index and the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which tries to review the evidence and make recommendations on effective interventions. So I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to talk about scalable low tech to minimize learning loss during the COVID pandemic and beyond. Let me just check this clicker. Okay, perfect. So Youth Impact, we have a few core pillars. Youth is at the core. We want young people to be able to thrive. We also are firmly committed to evidence. So all of the programs that we deliver are rooted in randomized control trial evidence. We also work really closely with government. So in Botswana, we have a standing memorandum of understanding with the government to deliver programs nationally. And our co-founder actually chairs the government's National Youth Council. So just to give you a spread, and then I'll dive into the evidence, we have a few programs. One is called Zones. It's a sex education program. Another is Teaching at the Right Level. This was pioneered by Pratham in India and tested by JPAL over 20 years. So we're one of the partners delivering this and an innovation hub across Africa. And then during COVID, we actually pioneered a new intervention, which we've called Connected. And you'll see this has a very intentional name about staying connected with families, even when schools were out. In terms of our footprint, we've served about 100,000 people. Our headquarters and hub is in Botswana, but we're now working with partners across 10 countries in various regions in Africa, in Asia, and others. We have a few core commitments. One is this commitment to rigorous evidence, and in particular to generate it rapidly. So as we know, sometimes studies can take 5 to 10 years, and that's great because it's very rigorous and very credible. We try to do it on a monthly basis so that we're generating rigorous evidence real time for policy and practice. And I would actually say I think a lot of the efforts that we've heard in this event are also in this spirit, where it was a nice long-term 10-year agenda of learning and iterating and improving, and it doesn't work and it does work. And I think that's actually in a similar spirit. EGRS 1, 2, 3, maybe there'll be 7, who knows. But we also, of course, want to get it to scale up. But this ongoing learning is really important, actually. Work closely with government, as I said, and have about 150 full-time staff throughout the country in Botswana. So I'm going to dive into the evidence. The context for this was before schools closed. We were delivering Teaching at the Right Level in about 20% of schools in Botswana. It's the coalition here you see at the bottom, similar partners actually to those involved in EGRS. The UNICEF, USAID have been involved, and others, JPAL, Pratham. So the COVID crisis, this is one we all know well, unfortunately. And it shuttered schools worldwide. Over 1.4 billion children were out of school. This is one of the largest school disruptions in history. One thing to note, actually, which we've been reflecting on, is while this was a historic school disruptions actually happen in other settings as well. And I'm going to come back to this point, whether it's teacher strikes, weather shocks, natural disasters, but this was certainly historic in scale. So how do you reach people when school is out? One of the amazing things about school is most children are there. That's actually a tremendous success. We now take it for granted. It wasn't always the case. But when school is disrupted, how do you reach people? So what you can see here in the figure is access to internet versus radio versus TV versus phone by income category of country. And what you can see is in the teal is internet access, and in low, even all the way up to upper middle income countries, 60% or less of households are having access to the internet. I think we just saw that also in the presentation in the morning, that's gone up, but it's still 50, 60%. So it's not everyone, right? You're missing a lot of people. But in contrast, if you look at the magenta or whatever, the kind of reddish pink color there, that is high. That's 80 to 90% of people have phones. So this is really a way to reach people. We don't often actually think about phones and just picking up the phone and calling someone as technology, but it is, and it's one people are familiar with and have high access to. So we've built this low tech, going the low tech route, not just the high tech route, to reach people. So this is just picking up the phone, giving a text and a call. Why low tech? It doesn't sound very sexy, but it really is actually. I'm going to try to make the case that low tech can be as sexy or sexier than high tech. It's accessible. This is a big, you can't do any impact if you can't reach people. It's cost effective. This is a technology people have, so you don't have to provide new devices. You can actually focus on the pedagogy. Sometimes when we think about technology interventions, we do a lot on provision of hardware, tablets, laptops, and we actually forget about the pedagogy or even good software sometimes. And it's contextually appropriate. It's a technology people are familiar with. It's easier to maintain. They already are charging it. It's sort of there and in use. I'm using one particularly famous example of a failed program, One Laptop Per Child, which was a very hyped intervention to provide laptops to children. in low resource settings, which did not work and had rigorous evaluations showing it didn't work. It's not to say all laptop interventions can't work, and there's been some that have, but this is a very prominent one that didn't. So what was the intervention? You can see here just an SMS. So this is very simple numeracy content being delivered. And then on the right-hand side, this is happening once a week, a 20-minute phone call to a household, to caregivers and their primary school child. Very short call, actually, but very targeted. And this is just going through the content and walking the child and household through. And I'll get into more details on how this was done. The devil is in the details. So for example, we first, before we did the calls, actually asked the households who is the right caregiver to support the child in instruction. And about 70–75% of the time it was the parent, but 20–25% of the time it was a cousin, a sibling, a grandparent, a community member. So asking that question was really important, actually. Another thing that we asked is, what is the best way to engage? Do you want to just put the phone on speaker and the tutor instructor does a lot of the instruction? Or do you actually want to be participating actively in the call? And we actually left that up to the household, whatever their comfort level was, so that we can get into more of the details behind what was happening in this call. One way of thinking about this intervention, it was also really a tutoring intervention, essentially through the phone, one-on-one to the household. In addition, after every call, there was an assessment that was done remotely. What can you do in terms of your level? Can you add? Can you subtract? Can you multiply? And then based on the answer, that was then used to target the instruction in the next session. So if a child couldn't do addition, the instructor wasn't going to try to teach division in the next session. If the child could do addition, they could move on to the harder proficiency. So this is very much inspired by principles of teaching at the right level, differentiating instruction, targeting instruction, to make sure that you're getting this really at the level of the child. So that was done every phone call. So really accelerating learning and enabling targeted instruction for all. The study was a pretty large-scale study, 4,550 households, and you can see here this is a map of Botswana, and this is most of the highly inhabited regions of the country. In the middle there is mostly desert, and so 9 out of 10 regions in the country, very large scale. A coalition of Youth Impact, JPAL, a center at Oxford and Columbia University. And this ended up being one of the world's first RCTs during the COVID pandemic. So some of the world's first rigorous evidence on how to do distance education in the world, actually. And so this was really bringing evidence to bear at a time of a lot of uncertainty. I'm cutting to the chase with the results. So what do we see? What you see on the left-hand side is we had a treatment arm that was SMSs only. We hoped that this would work. This would be really scalable and amazing if you could deliver some content over SMS, but we don't see that that has an effect on its own. So you can see in terms of average level, that is whether you can add, subtract, multiply, divide, we don't see big effects there, about 0.02 of a standard deviation, and you can see in the confidence interval there it overlaps 0, so it's not significant. And also on place value and fractions, we don't see big gains. So SMSs would have been really nice, but on its own it wasn't enough. What you can see moving over to the right there is if it's complemented with this live phone call, you are seeing really big effects, 0.12 standard deviation gains, which is considered pretty big in the education literature. And you're also seeing this translate to place value and fractions, which interestingly were not taught actually. And so this is showing, or not taught as consistently. And so you can see this is sort of translating to other competencies as well. Then we actually had a sub-randomization within this on how targeted the instruction was. So we actually had a randomized set that was explicitly asked to do that assessment versus those that were not. It was sort of just a tool in the toolbox. And you can see what's interesting, in terms of average level, we see similar effects between targeted and not targeted. So everyone was focusing on the foundations. But then if it was targeted, they were able to go above and beyond, translating to place value and fractions in the green and the blue. So very interesting results here and showing there's some promise, but you really do need this live instruction through the phone. Very excited to share. This will be forthcoming in Nature Human Behavior in the next week, so stay tuned for that. And so it's also going to be, it's been peer reviewed and it's going to come out very soon. The working paper has been out and the formal publication will come out very soon. So a note of caution, this is some good news, but it is important to put this in context. In many cases, technology did not work during the pandemic. This is why we're seeing such large learning losses. Remote instruction was not as good as in-person instruction. We saw some evidence earlier on learning losses in South Africa. This has been shown in Brazil, in many settings now. There's also been some randomized trials trying some approaches also which have not worked. Dave has been involved in one of these and others in Sierra Leone and Kenya. So how do we reconcile all this? And another interesting point here to point out is prior to the pandemic, there was also really mixed evidence on EdTech, actually. And one of the key insights from that work, which I'm sure colleagues are familiar with, is that these input-focused approaches have not worked really well. So when only providing laptops or tablets, without the good software, without the good pedagogy, without enhancing teacher practice, that's not going to work. But often it happens, actually. It's exactly what happens. We have many cases, for example, and I'll just give an example from Botswana, where actually tablets have been given throughout the country, but they're actually stored in the closet. No one is using them. They're not actually fully supported. I don't know if that's the experience here, but we've seen that happen in a few places. And so needing to go beyond the inputs approach. So how do we reconcile all of this? A few thoughts to put out there. EdTech is often not effective, but it does seem to be effective, and it can be effective when it's used to help target instruction. So there's also been some evidence using adaptive software on computers that's had more promise. And when you make sure to focus on the pedagogy, not just the platform. Sounds obvious, but again, not often done. The other thing I would say is, given that our results in Botswana were very promising, but we were seeing that in general technology was not working as well during the pandemic, we felt the need for more evidence. So actually this study was the first in a series of studies. So since that study, we've actually now replicated that work in 5 additional countries. So 6 countries total, 6 randomized control trials in 18 months. So we've been we're, how do I say, very energetic but tired, as you can imagine, running 6 RCTs in 18 months all over the world. To our knowledge, this is actually the fastest, largest scale multi-country evidence ever generated in education. So it's been very exciting and quite a historic effort. And we're trying to generate an evidence base around not just effectiveness during the pandemic, but these approaches more broadly. In some settings, schools started to reopen and really thinking about how to build resilient education systems that can withstand these disruptions and shocks. So here you can see the countries, actually since all of them have been completed. This is in Uganda, Kenya, India, the Philippines, and Nepal, and the coalition of partners has really varied. So in the Philippines, it's the government and IPA. In Nepal, it's the World Bank, 2 NGOs, as well as the government. In Kenya, it's a large public-private school network. In Uganda, it's an NGO. So a really wide variety of partners. This is a coalition working on this effort. You can see it's a big and healthy coalition. What are we seeing? So this is not yet out, but it will come out very soon. We're seeing that in addition to the Botswana study, the Nepal results, which are actually in a policy note, so the working paper is not out, but the policy note is, we saw that effects were similarly effective, and really interestingly, in Nepal we actually had a treatment arm which was full government-led delivery, government teachers. We actually see that that works even better. So often the story we see is it sort of worked nicely with an NGO, and then when it was done at larger scale with the government, maybe it's more cost-effective, but not always as effective. We actually see that it was even more effective with the government, and we can share why we think that's happening. The other striking feature is not just the effectiveness, but the cost-effectiveness. So I think that's actually one of the things that's really unusual because it's so cheap. So when you look at cost-effectiveness, you get up to a year of world-class education for $100. So that's a really cost-effective effect. I would say in terms of effectiveness, it's sort of in the middle, 0.12, but in terms of cost-effectiveness is where it's really standing out. The other things we're seeing is it really can scale across context and delivery models. So stay tuned for the other results from the other countries, but so far this is what we're seeing. Another feature that we've been working on with this evidence is continuing to optimize it. So we're believers that you do have to keep the learning journey going, just in the similar spirit of 1, 2, 3. So we actually, in Botswana, kept optimizing it for scale even as we replicated it in other countries. So one thing we wanted to see is, was it really the case that this SMS could not work? We didn't want to give up on it because SMS is so scalable and cheap and easy. So what we tried to do is, in addition to the once-a-week SMS, we tried to do a twice-a-week SMS. It didn't work, unfortunately. So we had to kind of look at it in the face and move on from SMS. So then we said, okay, can we make the phone call even cheaper and more scalable? So one thing that we tried is, instead of doing it once a week, we actually did it every other week. Interestingly, we doubled the dosage. So instead of once a week for 20 minutes, we did it for 40 minutes every other week. So it's actually the same dosage, just distributed differently. But interestingly, this was cheaper and easier because half the battle was actually reaching the household and getting them on the phone. They would say, call back later, try again. And so actually we were able to reduce and make it more scalable and simple to implement. And this actually was cheaper and just as effective. So these are some examples of the continued optimization that's happening. I'm going to wrap up with some lessons and policy implications. So there's a series of things that we've learned around what it takes to get this right. One is finding the right ratio. So actually, in some settings, this is one of the reasons it looks like the teachers were more effective in Nepal, is they were much more realistic about how many students they could reach. The NGO was very ambitious. They said, we'll reach 30. That's what we do in the classroom. That's what we can do in this. But it was very hard to reach 30 because it was so much scheduling, trying to reach the household. The teacher said, we can reach 12 to 15 per week. And they were right. That's about how many people they could reach. So they reached much more students. So this ratio piece is really important. And it depends also on whether the teachers are full-time or part-time and thinking about this carefully and not just replicating the classroom ratio. Another is identifying the right caregiver. We're seeing in many settings this question actually wasn't asked. It was just assumed the parent would be the one to do it. This makes a really big difference in terms of who's going to deliver and support the intervention. And I'll just share another, this targeting of the instruction we see is really critical. So if it's not targeted, really difficult to get this right. And interestingly, we actually found it was easier to target through this intervention, and we had been delivering teaching at the right level before because it's one-on-one. And so you really can actually target the instruction to the level of the child. On that note, we were thinking about how do we take what we know before the pandemic and translate it to the pandemic. And so one interesting thing, if we look at the work on teaching at the right level before versus connected, this phone-based response, one of the key things behind teaching at the right level is reaching people where they are. That's both in terms of level and in terms of access. They were in school. So reaching at the right level in the pandemic meant reaching where they are, and that's where we saw low tech come in. Another piece was this targeting of instruction. As I mentioned, we kept that, and in fact, we saw that enhanced with this one-on-one interaction. And some things you don't adapt, some things work. We actually kept the focus on foundational skills, much harder to do higher order competencies through the phone. So it's not going to work for everything, but we found for the basics, it did a pretty good job. Wrapping up with a few policy implications here. Cost effectiveness. It's really important that we talk about not just effectiveness, but cost effectiveness. We've heard a lot about budgets, and actually it's been great to see that in a lot of the interventions presented at this event, there's costed implications. That's not always the case, so that's really important and nice to see. As mentioned, using this evidence to really provide some sense of where can the wind blow at a time of historic uncertainty. We had a lot of questions. Should we launch this as an intervention and a humanitarian response, or as a study, as an RCT in a time with all this need? We landed on the need to do this rapid cycle study because we just had so much uncertainty. But we wanted results within months, not within years. That's how we balanced it. Governments have really large ICT budgets. I'd be curious what the South African ICT budget is. And often they are spent on this hardware-based approach. So thinking about repurposing some of those budgets for pedagogy-focused interventions that use technology in addition to the provision of the hardware. That's something that we think could be an exciting area. I mentioned targeting. This is a model for that. And then I also want to bring up this point that this has really made us reflect on school disruption. This is an issue we did not think about before, I must admit. We did not think about what happens when schools are disrupted. We've realized it happens a lot. As I mentioned, earthquakes, natural disasters, weather shocks, teacher strikes, elections, summer breaks. It's actually estimated that billions of children are experiencing some kind of school disruption over a period, a kind of a 10-year interval. So we actually need toolkits as education systems to respond to this, to build resilient systems to respond to this. So hopefully this is a wake-up call for thinking about that. And then also just thinking about parent education and technology more broadly. This was a shock to parental engagement, also on a historic scale. Prior to the pandemic, a lot of parental engagement has been focused on information, things like report cards, things that are focused on kind of PTA. In this case, parents became the frontline workers, the frontline instructors. And it wasn't clear how effective that would be. They were busy, they were trying to maintain jobs. In some settings, the literacy levels were lower in the household, but we found they could be extremely effective with the right kind of support. And so really thinking about the implications of that going forward. A last thing here is we have seen a really high take-up in terms of policy guidance. So the World Bank, UNICEF, and FCDO have put out a series of reports, which I've been involved in, around how do we synthesize the evidence on what has worked pre-COVID and during COVID, and this is featured in those guidance notes around things to consider along a broad swath of other interventions. So I'll just wrap up here, and again to say thank you, and it's really quite an honor to be here and hear about all the incredible evidence and policy action that's ongoing here, so thank you. Should I stay here or one more? Okay.
Thank you very much, Gnome. We've got one more presentation and then we're going to get them all back up for a panel discussion. So I'd like to now ask Ms. Sibongile Khumalo to come up. Sibongile is Executive Director at the Learning Trust. And they've been doing a lot of work around community-based and after-school educational programs. So we're going to hear another perspective on some of the possibilities and the lessons that have been learned through the work that she's been involved in. So Sibongile, thank you, welcome. We're excited to hear from you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Sibongile Khumalo from the Learning Trust, and in honoring the theme of this session today, I want to speak about both elements of parental involvement and EdTech. And I'll do this by speaking to two examples that we've seen in the after-school context. And then at the end, I will share a little bit more about the work that we're doing with an after-school catch-up coalition, which is set up as a platform for collective learning and collaborative implementation, but also where partners advocate for the broader, wider adoption of after school as a critical part of the education ecosystem. And then it also explores the extent to which NGOs can begin to leverage public funding where it's available. So I think the first thing to note is that the job that teachers have on their hands is enormous, and that they do need support. And yesterday we spoke about training and coaching a lot, and I want to talk about coordinating an ecosystem of support around teachers that includes other role players, which might be of a benefit if we do agree here today that teachers cannot be expected to do everything. And so, of course, it's natural to then start looking to parents who are primary caregivers in the home to support learning. But there's been limitations to parental involvement, and I'm citing only 4 of them here. Firstly, the lack of parent education and time. And there are, in some instances, low levels of matric amongst parents. I think Stephen spoke to 40% in the EGRS yesterday. And then secondly, there's challenges with socioeconomic living conditions of people, and especially high rates of unemployment, which we all know about. And I think realistically, if we think about it, many parents of a current grade 1 today are between the ages of 25 and 35. So largely young people, right? And 70% of them or over, we know, are unemployed. And thirdly, another challenge is sometimes language differences between teachers and parents. So we spoke yesterday again about families living in a province or a country that doesn't speak their home language. And then lastly, a challenge can be parent and school staff attitudes towards each other. And often there can be a lack of trust, which can result in some contestation around who's responsible for what. So some of what I think may be useful to think about when we talk parental involvement is firstly expanding definitions of parents and even caregivers to include other community members. And this can be after-school practitioners in some instances, or even child and youth care workers. Some of you might know NACCW, which trains child and youth care workers and then places them in safe parks in communities. And also learner support agents. I think these examples kind of highlight the many resources that often act as caregivers beyond just parents. And then secondly, I think we can consider incentivizing caregivers. And I know there's already a question there about incentivizing teachers when Kolosa spoke, but incentivizing caregivers through income earning, right? So given the context of high unemployment, particularly amongst the youth population, which we have noted are parents of these children, this is a group that's desperate for an income. So not only should we acknowledge them as an asset in their communities, but also begin to find ways that we can more productively engage them in the work of the common good, if you will. And then thirdly, I think structuring after-school support with trained facilitators. So when we broaden that definition of parents and caregivers, then we can consider stipended or paid practitioners that are trained to deliver after-school support. And then lastly, I think to think about formalizing NGO partnerships with schools and their personnel. So in our recent survey, which we're doing in partnership with IPASA in a research, 95% of the after-school programs that we've been speaking to are reporting working directly with schools. And this is not only drawing learners from those schools, but also operating on the school premises. And many of them have MOUs with the department in place, and then permissions from schools and districts to operate from the schools. And so formalizing these relationships is important, and this can help address the relational issues, especially around trust and those competitive tensions. Okay, so an example of this, the Learning Trust specifically supports after-school programs that are community-based, a lot of them emerging embryonic organizations, which we describe as programs that are operating out of but alongside the curriculum very often as a supplement, or operating during the hours after school. So our job is to find these outstanding organizations and then strengthen their work so that they can grow to be resilient, successful, sustainable organizations as a critical support to schools and learners. Our partner organizations serve learners in quintile 1 to 3 schools, largely in townships and informal settlements, and some of them in rural areas. So a few years ago, we ran a small pilot in collaboration with WordWorks, which you all know, to expand literacy support initiatives at a community level in the foundation phase via after-school instruction. And this was done in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape Coastal Schools community. And part of this was also to enable WordWorks as an organization to scale by offering technical support to implementing partners that can adopt their methodology. So we use the Ready, Steady, Read, Write program of WordWorks, an in-school literacy program, which is designed to build solid language foundations and to also support learners to speak, read, and write in a second language. And WordWorks would train and mentor site coordinators who in turn would then manage and support reading instructors to work with pairs of children on a weekly basis for at least 6 months. Many of them were parents or caregivers, and especially women who were unemployed and sometimes volunteered at those local schools. And we could do this obviously because there's no qualification required to deliver the WordWorks program. And we work specifically with 7 organizations, so these are after-school programs, who then implemented the program across 15 schools with 19 coordinators, and then trained over 160 of these caregivers. 6 of the partner organizations of the 7 have continued to run the Ready, Steady, Read, Write program, led by a trained community member, and 4 of them have now even joined our Catch-Up Coalition. Since that project, WordWorks contributed to the after-school COVID-19 resource that we called the Treasure Box, which is still available to learners from 2020, and then have also developed what they call the TIME materials, TIME standing for Together in My Education, which is for at-home learning that they started in the Western Cape as part of recovery efforts to catch up learners. And the pilot's successful implementation was due to a few reasons. Firstly, that we as the Learning Trust gave grants to WordWorks and implementing partner organizations to enable them operationally to do that work. And then secondly, that caregivers were actually gaining a valuable skill as paired reading facilitators, but also they earned an income by means of a stipend. So they were incentivized to show up. And then thirdly, these were caregivers whose children went to the same schools in a lot of the cases, so were largely local and didn't have to travel to the school. So there was also huge buy-in, and we also saw improved relationships between these parents and their school community. So that was just one example of parental involvement. I'll go into another example and speaking to Edtech, because I think there's been renewed expectation and interest in what it can help us achieve in the recovery phase. So different types of Edtech interventions, Gnome spoke to them, especially during the pandemic, have been used, especially in the after-school space, including the use of existing communications channels like WhatsApp and Telegram. There was also, in those cases, a facilitator on the other end who would call the students, follow up, that kind of engagement. And this was used by organizations like Olicomat, like the VELE program, which is an online program involved in the WOZA matrix, both of which are now coalition partners. But I choose to highlight Click Foundation because Click structured self-led learning program, and it operates in the foundation phase, and in terms of Edtech, the self-led learning type has been found to be among the most effective. And Click recently completed a insightful book chapter, and firstly it was so that they can highlight some of the enabling factors for implementing Edtech in quintile 1 to 3 schools, and then also presenting possibilities for measuring literacy outcomes at scale, and then thinking about exploring other impact evaluation strategies going forward. So what you see on the slide is just some quotations from reviews that are mentioned in that paper as well, in that book chapter. So the Brookings Center reports that the majority of Edtech interventions are not externally evaluated, and especially not using RCTs. A 2018 review that was cited in that book chapter looked at 26 studies on the use of hardware in teaching, and found that the bulk of the studies find no results at all, or there was an ambiguous result with some positive, some negative results. But it was later found, I think Gnome made this point, that after COVID, results looked a bit different. So it was later found that because self-led learning EdTech addresses learner-specific gaps by adjusting the level and pace of instruction, there were consistent improvements in learning outcomes, especially in developing countries. And the programs are often cost-effective, since computer labs in schools and communities can be accessed by multiple learners. So it's been noted that the best use of these applications is to complement classroom instruction and to fill content gaps. So there have been mixed reports, as mentioned before. So just to tell you a little bit about Click, it specifically deploys the Reading Eggs suite of online English literacy applications in underprivileged primary schools in 5 provinces, and then to learners in grade R to 7. Learners work at their own pace through the apps for a targeted 22 hours per learner per annum, which sounds small. The apps are learner responsive, they're level appropriate, and they deliver English content to build the 5 component skills of successful reading, and we know those. They also feature games, videos, ebooks, and quizzes, and then they're delivered with animated characters and songs. They also give rewards with, tokens and prizes as learners progress at their own pace, so it's kind of very gamified. The platform tracks progress and matches activities to the learner's ability, thereby solving for classroom heterogeneity. The tracking platform extracts learner-level data from SASAMs using the DDD, the Data-Driven Districts Dashboard, and CMIS in the case of the Western Cape, and then tracks the progress via unique login for each learner. So some of those enabling factors, for the model to work, they've determined that firstly, there needs to be working and reliably connected hardware, which is difficult, obviously, in a low-income setting. A lot of the schools found a suitable place for a computer lab has been maybe a staff room, a classroom, a storeroom in some cases, or even a library. And 92% of the schools were able to find that space. And then for those that couldn't, they deploy mobile tablet trolleys in classrooms, and about 8% of them do. Click works in 230 schools currently. And so schools must provide the space and other basic resources like the tables and chairs, etc., and then Click will provide the equipment. And then secondly, they find that functioning devices, quick response times, maintenance, troubleshooting, and technical support is important. So it's been found that without procurement, maintenance, and support, a lot of these EdTech interventions often fail. Click themselves have a network of regular suppliers who do monitoring and maintenance with 48-hour turnarounds. Therefore, downtime is limited. And thirdly, internet connectivity is the primary enabler of the program. So this relies on a constant data stream to deliver and monitor app usage. So the internet service provider, RAIN, which we all know, provides pro bono data to 200 of the 230 schools that they work in. And lastly, that security is one of the greatest challenges. I think in 2019, Click had 6% of their devices stolen, and they had to make significant security reinforcements, including hidden cameras and safes for the devices. And then their partnership with the police service also led to arrests. So by 2021, only about 1% of their devices were stolen. And Click over the last 3 years has grown their numbers significantly. They're now reaching about 130,000 learners, and they plan to increase their number of schools from 230 to 1,000 by 2025. They've learned many lessons so far, and there's still some way to go in reaching the targeted hours, which is difficult to get access to the kids in grades R to 4 to do that. And they're now looking to commission research to determine how many hours are required to achieve gains in literacy and comprehension, but also we are working with them this year to validate what they call an e-quiz assessment, which is based on the EGRA. And the e-quiz can be conducted quickly and at minimum cost, and the results are also available in real time. In the meantime, they've done some analysis using the Western Cape Systemics in 2019, comparing the difference in performance between click learners and provincial averages. And from a lower base, learners participating in the click program for an average of about 17.5 hours significantly outperformed the provincial averages. This, of course, doesn't present evidence of impact due to the very small sample sizes. There were 2,500 learners across 4 schools, and then sampling biases. But the potential for large-scale learner support does need to be investigated to determine the causal impact on literacy outcomes and the required minimum dosage to see those changes. So those are 2 examples of both parental involvement and EdTech that we've seen in the after-school context. But in response to the catch-up imperative, the Learning Trust has conceptualized and convened what we call an after-school catch-up coalition, which will bring partners from diverse settings, firstly the nonprofit after-school organizations that we already work with, but also schools and other interventionists and researchers and social employment initiatives. And then hopefully also provincial and district education departments, all with differentiated levels of commitment and responsibility. We've been inspired by evidence that after-school interventions actually work, and this has been reported with some case studies that we released last year in our after-school investment case of 2021. In thinking through the role of after-school in education recovery, though, we were guided by the definitions from the Accelerated Learning Working Group. And that's what you see now projected. So accelerated learning meaning faster development of foundational knowledge and basic skills, and then catch-up programs being more shorter-term programs for learners who've missed chunks of content, and that might be due to any unplanned disruptions like COVID. And then bridging programs, which is really about preparing for entry into different learning programs, and then remedial programs, which are any additional targeted support that happens concurrently with the regular teaching. So an example being the WordWorks program. And so these are the implementation priorities of the coalition. And the coalition wants to explore the extent to which we can firstly extend the school day with after-school programs providing enrichment programs, and then connecting the home to the school by engaging all manner of caregivers in learning, and then making use of EdTech for learning where it's possible, and then drawing from national standardized assessments for baseline data and impact measurement when those results are available in 2023. There are 2 key implementation objectives here that I just want to point to. One is the scaling of both working practice and models through funding that allows for model adoption for organizations, and then leveraging public funding for employment through the implementation of the Social Employment Fund. So we're working on delivering the Social Employment Fund. It's in partnership with the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, and as an after-school sector, as a consortium led by the Learning Trust, we will be employing about 3,500 people across 30 organizations and 9 provinces. And of course, this is no BEEI, so we're not doing 300,000, but it is a huge undertaking for our sector. And how is it different from the BEEI? So after-school program practitioners operate outside of the confines of school. So that's why I'm not calling it a public employment program, but a social employment fund. And are not in the classroom with teachers where I think Dave said yesterday, they're not deferring to the teacher, but are supplementing learning that's happening beyond the classroom. Okay, I'm not going to get into this, but it was just to say that the coalition is now exploring a partnership with DGMT's Zero Dropout campaign, which has been running a pilot in 5 KZN schools with dual language instruction in isiZulu and English, delivered by NSCCW's child and youth care workers, and results of it will be available in October, and we can share them with this platform here, but using the TAL methodology. So they're partnering with TAL Africa, and we know those 4 elements of TAL, so we are to see what the results are, but hope that we can also adopt that within our catch-up coalition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. And now, if you could come straight back, as well as the rest of the panelists, we're going to have a follow-up discussion.
Mixing agendas.
Yeah, let's do that.
Are we going according to?
Let me stay there.
Should I go in?
Yeah.
Share the mic, that's
As we sanitize it in between.
All right, thank you very much for those presentations. So we're now going to have a follow-up discussion about ICTs in education, technology in education, and parents and community involvement as well. I guess it's all kind of linked. So I want to ask a question to each of you about your perception of the limits and the possibilities of these things that we've learned through the pandemic. So I'll let you choose the extent to which you want to focus on parents and community involvement as opposed to use of technology in education, or whether you want to mix it up because they are linked in some ways. But if you could reflect, if each panelist could just take a couple of minutes to reflect on, in particular, the lessons from the pandemic, on the limits as well as the possibilities that you think we've learned about. So, Kolose, can you start? We can go in the order that everyone is sitting, and tell us your thoughts on that question.
So the limits and challenges of using technology during the pandemic.
What we've learned about the limits and the
learned.
possibilities of using technology as a result of our experience in the pandemic.
Okay. I think during the pandemic, we saw that there's a lot of people have access to technology. For instance, a lot of people have access to a phone. People can receive SMSs, people have television sets, and all of these platforms were used to share resources for educational purposes during the pandemic. But I think the limit for me in my experience is ensuring fidelity, and that what is shared is actually being effective, and if it's targeted practice. I think Gnome mentioned that whether it's targeted to reach not just the learners and broadly, but individual learner needs. So as much as technology is there and there are programs on radio or TV or apps, but that the targeted use of them and like making them more accessible to different variations of learners and reaching a broader group of learners. And then I think in terms of parents, during the pandemic, I think with parents and children spending more time together, I think the challenges were that parents are not educators, and they weren't necessarily trained. But I think in practice, from the research that I've done, a lot of parents are willing to engage with content, but I think there needs to be more, a better relationship between schools and teachers and parents, and how to access materials and in how to use those materials at home. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Gnome, your thoughts on that question?
I had even more thoughts as I was listening. So, no, it's a great point. I mean, one thing I would say is I think this is from other work actually, but I think it feeds into this. If you look, so the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF did a survey of Ministry of Education responses around the world to the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of reform and change actually. Governments changed their curriculum, which we know is an incredibly difficult thing to do. They reduced class sizes. I mean, they did all these things. And so I think it was an eye-opener that that kind of change is actually possible. I'm really curious how much of that will stick and how much of that will be repurposed for really effective educational instruction. But till this day, a lot of those reforms are actually in place. So I think one shred of hope, I think, is that those changes are possible. Maybe we do need a crisis to institute them. That's now happened. How are we going to take those forward? On the limit side, a household survey showed that while these high-level policy changes happened, in practice, households rarely received some of these policies. So for example, on the tech side, governments did provide radio instruction. They did provide television, but in some cases, only 10% of households tuned in. So I think an important piece is, even when we get those policy reforms right, how do we make sure it actually reaches households in a way that works for them? And there needs to be a lot of work on that bridging of the gap. The other things I would say on this are, I think there is an opportunity to engage caregivers more, actually. I think we have to do it cautiously. Caregivers are busy. They're juggling many things. But I think there is an opportunity for caregivers to support. And actually, in many high-resource settings, this is de facto what caregivers are doing. So providing tools to do this in a low-resource setting and confidence, actually. We saw that parents had very low confidence, but once they started doing it, they said, I can do this, actually. And so I think it's a real opportunity to progress that. I also think it's an exciting moment to think about tutoring. Tutoring is one of the single most effective education interventions. There's been over 100 randomized control trials on tutoring. A lot of those trials are in high-income settings. There's been fewer in low-income settings and middle-income settings. But if it can be done cheaply and scalably, it's really exciting. We did that through the phone, but there's other ways of doing that in person as well. So those are a few thoughts, and there's more. But I'll stop there.
Thanks. Spongile, your thoughts?
I think Gnome covered it. But I do think that the pandemic showed us that, we are more innovative when disaster strikes. So even the fact that we were able to change the curriculum and, institute all of these changes was because of disaster. But I do hope that some of them will stay, right, in the system, all the changes that we did make. We had issues also in the after-school sector, by the way, in engaging especially parents in the home. So I'm not speaking about the extended or expanded definition of caregivers here. Testing and testing again, and even you, Gnome, spoke about not wanting to give up on the SMS. I do kind of feel we gave up too quickly on parent involvement, and we could have seen an element of that in EGRS 2 and 3, and yeah. So I do think it will take time, and we need to invest the time.
Great. Noted. Martin?
Thank you. So the question of what have we learned in the pandemic? I'm glad Gnome mentioned the issue of curriculum trimming. I think we call it curriculum trimming here, focusing more sharply on core competencies. I think that's probably the really big impact, or positive impact that the pandemic has had. It's made us learn that the importance of core competencies. So I'm not so sure that the impact of the pandemic on parent roles, EdTech has been that great. I think in terms of technology, the really important thing is that much of the administration in the education system has gone online now. And I think that's a really important culture shift. You know, we don't have to fly to Cape Town to present a 15-minute presentation to Parliament any longer. Okay, that's just one particularly interesting example, and I'm very grateful that we don't have to do that. We've learned something, and I think that kind of understanding is going to kind of work its way through the system, because a lot of what changes in the system is top-down. Not all of it, but a lot of it is top-down. And if people in the administration start to understand technology and its benefits better, I think that's good for the system. It's probably, for instance, going to facilitate better online teaching for teachers. But in many ways, we've not changed when it comes to EdTech. I mean, we have Gnome, you mentioned that many developing countries have large budgets. I wouldn't say that that's true in South Africa for EdTech. And that's partly because we don't really have a clear strategy on what we want to do, and Treasury doesn't put money on things where there is not a very clear strategy. I mean, we do have, as an organizing framework, Fourth Industrial Revolution, which often, is put forward as something that's universal. It's not. The World Bank and UNESCO don't like it. This is a World Economic Forum thing. We've adopted it, and many other countries have adopted it as a framework. But what does it really mean? I think that's not very clear. We're focusing at the primary level a lot on bringing in coding and robotics to pilot schools. That's obviously interesting, and we'll see, how that impacts on learning in general in those pilot schools. I think we're still concerned, I think, that access to technology is still weak and very unequal at the secondary school. Half of white learners, for instance, have some kind of technology subject, engineering, graphics and design, computer applications technology. They're doing this. Indian students as well. Black African and colored students, it's down to it's about 8%. So there are huge inequalities which relates at the secondary level. And I think part of the EdTech challenge is to deal with those kinds of inequalities. It's not exactly EdTech, but technologies in school are needed and should be more equally accessible. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so the next question is going to be more about the system readiness for scaling up some of these ideas. So it could be, what do you think needs to happen next in the case of parent or community involvement, or in the case of using technology? What are maybe the more pressing needs in terms of scaling some of these things up? What are some of the constraints to that? How can we foster better use of tech and better involvement of parents? Because also reflecting on EGRS 1, for instance, the issue was not that parental involvement doesn't help, but it's about how do you change parental involvement. So at a large scale, as we take these lessons to scale, what do you think are some of the next steps that are important? We can go in the same order if that's okay with people.
I think for me it's recognizing that there is differentiated need and that some areas will need different levels of support. In terms of virtual coaching or using technology, we know that it's scalable, but then where is the real need for that, and how can it be implemented? So I think at the system level, from national to provincial to district level, is figuring out what the needs are in the different contexts. For example, we spoke a lot about Gauteng yesterday and the language fluidity there, whereas some provinces, in KZN it's just isiZulu, and therefore interventions there will need to look different than what they look like in Gauteng. And also the budget there looks different to what it looks like in Gauteng. So I think for me it's a more targeted focus and recognizing the different levels of need. And within the quintiles, the schools that we work in, yes, they may be in the same quintiles, but there are different levels of needs. I mean, even in classrooms, some classrooms within quintiles 1, 2, 3 are very print and material rich, and some have nothing. So I think it's a big project that needs like more targeted approaches and inputs.
So I don't know if this is the most important thing, but I think it's something that is important, which is delivering something effective. If it's really effective, I think people get excited about it, actually. And so one thing that we've seen work well is when we start to do it and it starts to work, actually a lot of the system takes notice, and there's a lot of positive political pressure around it. So for example, when we started, there was a lot of confusion and nervousness. Actually, one parent even phoned the Minister of Education directly and said, "What is this? You know, is this real? Do I really not have to pay for this? Is it a scam? You know, these people are calling me." Luckily, we were doing this with the Ministry of Education, so they said, "No, this is real." By the end of it, there was a few regions we weren't delivering it, and they were calling us all the time saying, "When are we going to get this program?" We said, "Call the offices in the ministry." And then they started to do that, and then the ministry said, "Can we start delivering this in the region?" So I think sometimes we think about rolling things top down, but I think there's a real power to delivering things and getting some pressure bottom up, actually. Getting something working that households, communities, schools, principals, teachers are excited about can then matchmake top down and bottom up together. We've seen a similar experience happen actually pre-pandemic, where, and we can do this in Botswana because Botswana is a small country, we actually delivered it to 10 to 20% of schools. And then there was a primary school heads meeting, and actually the thousands of school heads were in the same room. And the Ministry of Education announced that this was going to be scaled up nationally, and they asked if anyone could speak to it. And 15% of hands in the room went up, and they said, "I testify, this works, we want it." It was very interesting because then everyone else started to want it. And so I think something that is helpful is having that top-down strategy and plan, but also making sure that these programs that are working, these reforms that are working, exist in the real world, and people can see them, get excited about them, and apply that pressure up as well.
Great.
Yeah, I think there are no silver bullets. And yeah, it's long-term change that we need to make and the investment. But I also think that we need to engage parents, and I'm speaking not about EdTech, but about parental involvement, as people. So, part of my philosophy in life is around connection and connecting with people. And I think Mpumi did that so beautifully here yesterday when we were talking about home language and the use of it in the workplace. And I think when we can begin to say, I am that parent, or I was that child, or I could be that teacher, that we shift a lot in our thinking. So just that as a basic. I think people want to connect and have their voices heard. So I think we need to think about some of this in engaging parents, because a lot of the communication happens one way. There's a lot of expectation that is placed on parents. We ask them to do this at home, to take this home and do this with their children, but we don't ask them for input. We don't ask them what might work in their household and that sort of thing. So I do think we need a two-way conversation. And then also I'm biased because, I think community organizations are an untapped resource beyond the parents. So I think building relationships. And we've seen this in individual schools, of course, and in districts, but in some instances in provinces that have centered relationships with organizations, how actually delivery of programs at a school level and support by community members works better than if you don't.
Great. Thanks for those ideas. Martin?
So, yeah, what are the opportunities going forward? There are obviously opportunities associated with EdTech, but there's a lot, but there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how fast this is going to move. fortunately, there's a lot we can do without EdTech. I'd say there are two trends which I think are important. One is, Kolosa brought up the issue of language, how it's different in different provinces, sometimes more kind of monolingual contexts, in other areas of the country, very diverse. What's positive is that there's a lot more work. There's not enough, but there's a lot more work on African languages currently, and that is essential if we're going to take the pedagogy forward in that area, and that doesn't require EdTech. EdTech can enhance it, but it's work that is happening, and there's no reason it shouldn't continue. The other thing that I think is good is that we increasingly have tools that are available to monitor reading at schools. These tools are becoming more accessible to teachers. I think the challenge here for us is to go a lot further and do the type of thing that has happened in Peru, where essentially parents, getting to the issue of parents have tools that they can use at home, not necessarily to teach children, but to understand whether their children can read or not, so that they are then in a better position to go to school and say, look, there's a problem, so that this can be discussed at school governing body meetings using tools that work and that parents can engage with. So I think those are two areas where I think there's promise going forward, and EdTech can also offer us things, but we don't know how fast that will move. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. I'm going to ask one more round of questions, but it's going to be a different question for each panelist, sort of somewhat linked to what they've been doing. And then we're going to open up to the floor. So please keep questions, get them ready, and the comments as well. Let me start, Sibongile, with you. And on that last point that Martin made about tools in the hands of parents to assess where their children are at, you also spoke about giving assessment tools and getting assessment done in homes and in communities. And I'm interested to know, yesterday, I think it was Mpumi sharing a bit more about the reading benchmarks works that's been done and is still being completed, where we have now sort of more clear guidance specific to the different languages about where children in grade 1, 2, and 3 should ideally be in terms of being on track, things like words per minute, read correctly. Do you feel like that we could build on that at the level of communities and parents to build societal consciousness and at a societal level, but even in the household level, understanding where your children are at? Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think Martin made the point earlier that everyone here thinks assessment around EGRA primarily. But, the TAL methodology uses the ESSA, which is very low cost and can be run at any time and by anyone. So when we start adopting TAL, and I say when because I think it needs to happen and should and will, then that's a tool in the hands of parents and after-school practitioners and community members where they can assess where learners are at and then move them into the next group. That's the really great thing about TAL, that we can move from group 1 into the next group based on that assessment as well. So I think there are opportunities there outside of the EGRA to use other forms of assessment.
Great. Okay, cool. Then, Kolosa, can I ask you, you spoke in your presentation a lot about the EGRS 2 project with tablets using for teachers, and we've done that not only in Mpumalanga for 3 years, where you were involved, but also now in the Northwest, where we're again using electronic tablets to distribute lesson plans. Can you talk a little bit about the real practical issues around just managing tablets, data issues, connectivity, all those kinds of issues? Just if you can share a little bit about some of the challenges we've experienced and lessons we've learned.
Well, I think you touched on some of the challenges that we've experienced, data challenges, connectivity issues, and I think to that we have made the content available offline. So I think that was a key, that's been progress from the time that we started using the technology to make sure that teachers in the different districts that we operate in are able to access the content and are able to also load the work that they've done onto the tablet and submit it even if they don't have data, and then we are able to then take that information and use it to monitor the progress. So I think for me that like making it more accessible to me, not just having a tablet, but then making it easier to use for the teachers. And I also think for the coaches in monitoring the implementation and fidelity to the program to ensure that coaches are going to the school currently with EGRP, it's on-site coaches, so making sure that coaches are also going and reinforcing using the tablet and how to use the tablet, and like I said earlier, providing support in terms of troubleshooting if there are IT challenges. So I think we learn also from the negative outcomes. I think it was Prof. Brahms who said this yesterday, that there are lessons that can be taken even from the negative outcomes, and that will, and I believe will improve the use of technology, and in this case, the tablets, especially if we want to make it scalable. There's a lot that has been learned in the Northwest and Mpumalanga.
Great, thank you. Then Gnome, and Martin, you can listen in as well, because I'm going to tweak this question slightly for you after Gnome. I want you to talk a little bit about the almost like the politics and the sexiness that you spoke about around ICT, because I was influenced by your work and by this presentation. I must admit, I learned something and I thought this makes quite a lot of sense. But I'm trying to think about pitching that, because you spoke about redirecting funds. As Martin pointed out, there's not like actually a lot of funds in the bigger scheme of things. But I'm trying to think of pitching that as opposed to some of the other things that we're doing in the broader tech space, or coding robotics, or ICTs, paperless classrooms, some of these ideas, and saying, hey, I think we should redirect all this attention and work to phoning parents and homes. Do you have any ideas for how we can dress that up or sell that?
It's a great point. I think it's a great recommendation if the House agrees. It would be to, of course, robotics are important, but focusing on the foundations and thinking about ICT in a way of getting the best pedagogy to get those foundations, be it the phone or whatever is appropriate, I think would be a transformative redirection, actually. So I think that would be great. One thing I will say, we do find that this idea does catch. I will say the term low tech has not worked politically, and so it works for the research paper. I would say in the real world, what we do with it is that's why we gave it a new name. We gave it the name Connected, and actually has a nice logo. I didn't show it because this is sort of a half research conference. So I can show you the nice logo, and then maybe you'll be even more convinced. But we did have to do that because no one wants to go low. I mean, that's not a very attractive thing, right, to sell politically. So actually, as we started to work with more governments and they said, we want to do this, how are we going to pitch it to our stakeholders? They said, can we give it a better name? So we tried a few, actually. We tried M-Learning, like mobile learning. We tried a few things, and we actually have gotten to something, a nice brand and name. Makes a big difference because the concept we found people do get quite excited about. The redirecting is a whole nother ball game, but people do get excited about it. And I think in particular, pitching it as both a way to use technology well, but also to engage parents. There's so much desire and interest politically to engage parents, because those are also politically active constituents, that can be a nice angle and an entry point into this. And actually, I didn't share this, but we asked parents, did they want to keep receiving the program? And even if schools reopened, actually, I should have shared this, 99% of households said we want to keep receiving the program. I've actually never seen that number in real life, 99%. And
Surely
we
at
kept
school.
asking that question, and it kept being 98 to 99%. So it really is tapping into something in the household, actually.
Okay, great. Interesting. So Martin, similar question, but maybe to tweak it a little. I mean, you spoke a little already, Martin, about like things like e-learning policies and that, and then also the niche technology subjects and some of the basics that need to be put in place. But if you can also talk a little bit about the kind of maybe politics, political economy, but also planning around this, and give us a sense of what is in our existing plans, like the MTSF, the department sector plan. What are we saying in those spaces around incorporating technology, and even some of those things like to what extent is the balance, is the focus on some of the more aspirational, sexy tech ideas versus subjects, coding and robotics versus connectivity at schools? What are we planning in that respect currently as government?
Well, I mean, at the national level, not that much. I mean, the emphasis in the MTSF is very much on this coding and robotics at the foundation level. And I mean, if I was a teacher at a primary school, I'd be thrilled. You know, it sounds exciting. But I think what's lacking at the national level is a clear process that is going to take us to a very practical strategy, not a very kind of idealistic one, but one that takes into account what has happened in the rest of the world, what do people expect. It's not only about what works in RCTs, but society's expectations around what their children should have access to is obviously very important as well. It's a political thing as well. So what we're not seeing, I think, currently is a clear process that will take us to a strategy. And as the World Bank and others have said, countries that do EdTech well have a strategy. They do it in Indonesia quite well. We're not there yet. Some provinces, such as Gauteng and Western Cape, have strategies in place. So I think a lot of the work has happened at the provincial level, but that ends up, in a sense, exacerbating inequalities because certain provinces are left behind. I always call Limpopo a kind of tech desert because whatever indicator you look at, it's really, really much weaker than all the other provinces. I think we do need to encourage that work at the province level, and I think Gauteng and Western Cape's work should be learned from to a greater degree, and I think the National Department has a role to play in looking at what's happened in those provinces. But I think more kind of proactive work, policy work at the national level, I think would also be good. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Now the time has arrived for questions and comments from the floor. So let's start there with Kaya. We've got Mary, we've got Mpumi, we've got Andile. Let's take those four, and then I'll come back to the floor. We'll come back to the right wing shortly. The mics will be passed around. I think the people online might like to hear you as well.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the panel. So just a few comments. I do have one question for Prof. Gustafsson, but the other two are just comments to the other panel members. So with parental involvement or engagement, I think we need to get to a point where we clearly define what we want to achieve in terms of parental involvement, because I find that at times what we fall into the trap of saying we want to involve parents because we want learner outcomes, just an example. And I think it's not a straight line. you know. So, and I think maybe EGRS also fell into that trap, and when you didn't see the gains, you kind of like stopped, you know. I'm not saying that's the case, but I see more and more that and I think we need, as a system, we need to define what exactly we want out of parents. Is it a supplementary role where parents are facilitating and helping learners at home, and therefore we don't have a direct, we say, we want learner outcomes of parental, programs, or, so I think we need to get to a point where we define exactly what we want out of parental involvement. That's the first thing. Secondly, as it relates to EdTech, I find, my sense has always been that the literature internationally is mixed about the effectiveness of EdTech generally, not just, but what I find more and more in the country around the discourse is that we kind of like are very dismissive of technology, and we kind of like use our context and say, no, it won't work. But I think we also need to get to a point where we've actually done rigorous assessments and evaluations of technology programs, and then we can make arguments about But I just find that in most cases, we all make our own personal views about technology rather than being evidence-led. Because the literature is mixed. It's not saying, it's this or that, but I just find that the discourse in the country probably more negative than promoting the use. And I get the context, but I think we need to use evidence rather than having our personal opinions around it. And then the question, I think, is you spoke up in your presentations around what we had expected and what the needs cramp data was saying around maybe dropouts and other things. And I suppose it's a concern. I'm not saying anything critical, but I think we make a lot of decisions around the reports that come out at a particular time. So when we then subsequently find data saying something else, it does raise a bit of a concern, at least from where I'm sitting, because if then there were, conclusions being made, which we make decisions on, whether we are donors or not. So I just wanted to get your sense from around that. If data was saying something at a particular point in time, it may be that data changes over time. But if then the DBE data says something completely different, for me it does raise a concern. But just to get your thoughts around that, thanks.
Great, thank you. Mary is next, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that panel. Now, I want to raise two issues, I think. The first is the issue of opportunities and inequalities, which I think Martin and several others have also referred to. So I think that the successful implementation of excellent work that's been shown, and I was very excited by the work in Botswana, depends on an ecosystem of IT capacity that goes beyond what we do in education. And I am concerned about, and this is a difficult policy issue that goes beyond IT, it's the across education. How do you advance everyone step by step without holding some back, disadvantaging others? So a targeted strategy which looks at most in need requires thought and investment that really ensures that we reach those who currently are not accessing IT support. And that means that we need to be very vigilant in terms of current inequalities in IT and not exacerbate the divide. So definitely a targeted approach, but with an ecosystem that needs to be built, which is complex. If we don't do that, what we're going to do is to exacerbate inequalities. I think that's clear, no? Yeah. So the second point, and I was fascinated, Martin, by your data, because first of all, I said, surely not, but this question of looking at computers in schools and looking at tablets in schools. Because if you look at the Stats SA report on access to education under COVID, which they released last year, what we're beginning to see, I think, is much, and I think you might have also hinted at this, much more access to individual devices than devices within the system, with all of the problems of devices in the system. And I won't mention the Eastern Cape for fear of embarrassing. And also, even in the privileged provinces, I'm not always sure it's as real as it's presented. So if you look at that Stats SA report, what they're saying is that as many as 45% of Black African learners attending school now have a cell phone. And I think that that means that in policy terms, we need to shift much more to the realities of that, but within the systemic constraints of access to Wi-Fi, cost of connectivity, but in terms of connecting with parents and learners, there's much more access. But the divides in terms of race and class are huge. So both questions are connected. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Pumi.
Thanks for the presentations. I have some online questions, and then I have my own questions. The online questions are, is the DBE open to redoing or extending research on parental involvement? Stephen, that one's for you. Another one for you, Stephen, the difference between PSRIP and EGRS. And then for the panel, 2 questions. What role do partnerships have on accelerating program implementation and taking advantage of existing government relationships? The next one, during evaluation in EGRS 2, Kolosa, this is for you, were lesson observations done in virtual coaching classes, and were changes in practice seen? Double-clicking that one, how did you find out what type of coaching was more effective in terms of classroom practice? Great, and then my questions. I guess a question to the panel in general, do we know if we have any technology pedagogical programs in any African languages? So the reading eggs look fantastic, great for English. But you know, as we know, majority, home language, etc. Do we have that, and does anyone have thoughts on whether we should be working in that area, ideas? And is EdTech best for early grades or later grades? And then I think 2 last ones. Considering the current access, Martin, maybe this is for you, would you recommend technology interventions at home or in schools, considering the spread of who has what? And then lastly, technology was used as, I guess, as a way of delivering schooling during the pandemic, but do we think we should be using it still for learning losses? So linking, I guess, between Gnome and Martin, where do learning losses feature now that the pandemic is finished, but we have these learning losses? Thanks.
Cool, thanks for calling the end of the pandemic, Mpumi. Andile? Sasa's almost there.
Thanks. A few weeks ago, we were presenting on cell phone penetration in South Africa, and someone was asking, where are all those children who have cell phones? I'm hoping that the panel can just address that, because I still want to be able to respond to that question. Martin, you know, the issue around policies, strategies, and practice is always one of the most difficult ones. South Africa has a policy for professional development in ICT. It has Operation Pakisa as a strategy. There's political week. There's even a speech by the president saying each child must have a cell phone. And how do we deal with all of those? How do we deal with the prescripts versus what's possible, and what Treasury says we can or cannot do given the pocket? The second comment that I have is around the struggles during COVID-19. So immediately when South Africa realized that we need to ensure continuation of learning, digital platforms were the first option. Quickly we realized that of course, those children that we're still looking for are not there. And radio and TV became an opportunity. But the struggle is to still to evaluate impact of these programs, both digital programs and those that are implemented through TV and radio, given the sequencing, the issues of where learners are, the learning gaps, and do you have any thoughts around how South Africa can strengthen that for this and any other emergency? The last question that I had is about, no, actually it's a comment around, I think Mary has covered this also. Issues of equity are really, really a struggle. So with digital learning and ICT, we say solutions should be there, connectivity, devices, affordable content, and involvement of all. But we are not dealing with issues of real infrastructure. So for an example, Eastern Cape went and gave all teachers laptops, but each teacher sits in their corner somewhere in Eastern Cape but cannot log on because there's no infrastructure, and with all the data that they have, that's not possible. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Thanks. Maybe we can go one by one, so starting on the far side with Colossa and working our way this way, just to respond to those questions that were relevant to you.
I'll respond to
Can
the
you just
question-
speak into the mic?
Sorry. I'll respond to the question about which type of coaching was more effective. I think we found that on-site coaching was more effective after 3 years because of the levels of increase in reading proficiency. And I think this is also attributed to the on-site coach being there, being able to observe the activities taking place in the classroom and providing that very targeted feedback, as opposed to the virtual coaching, which, like I said in my presentation, the teachers would volunteer the information that they wanted to volunteer, so the coach would not be able to provide as much targeted feedback as they would be if they were in the classroom. And then I think I also just wanted to comment on the role of partnerships in program implementation. I mean, the banner behind us shows all the partners that we work with, and I think just having worked in implementation in some of the projects, the DBE would not be able to do this work alone, and there's a lot of lessons that are gleaned from implementation partners and also funding partners on practices of how to improve and possibly also take the work to scale. So I think there is also, for me, I think there's a lot of potential in increasing partnerships and continuing to learn, especially with something like EGRS, where we've been working with some of the same partners for so long, and we have learned and are growing together. And I think for scaling, that is going to show very positive results when it comes to implementing in different provinces. Thank you.
Thanks. Gnome?
So I can just pick and choose, okay. All great points. One thing I would just say, to kind of connect the dots on the infrastructure point, I would agree. I think you do have to meet people where they are. It's nice to have kind of ambitious plans and move towards them, but if you want to do something now, you have to reach them where they are with the infrastructure they have. And I think both can happen, actually, simultaneously. I think that sounds very obvious, but it doesn't happen, actually. I think sometimes we design programs for the aspiration rather than the reality. On this really specific example at the end of teachers having these laptops and not being able to submit their data, I think that's really interesting and a good example, right, of some of this. And I think one thing I heard once, which I think is related to that, this is from Rukmini Banerjee, she said, data often defies gravity. It goes up and it never comes back down. And so I think in that case, one way is designing a system where it can flow with all the infrastructure, but the other is, if that's the reality, maybe a data flow process is not the right one, actually. Maybe we need a tool, a paper tool, that can be used there and there in the classroom to help gather the data and understand the data. So we've actually developed a tool like that that requires no data flow. And actually, it's very, very popular. So I think this kind of, what is the infrastructure? What can we actually do? What can we not do? Is really key, but actually often really missed instead of working for the aspiration. What is parental engagement? I think that's a great question. I'd love to know kind of what is the framework in the policy environment for what's considered meaningful parental engagement. One thing I will say is we're trying to tinker and understand what the best way to engage parents is in this approach. And I mentioned earlier, we at first kept it very open, whatever the parents wanted, speakerphone, or just give the phone to the child, or actively participate, or take over. We left it totally up to the parent or the caregiver. We're now trying to structure it a bit more. So we just did something where we did a randomized A/B test, and we do these monthly or every month testing exactly this kind of question, where we did the first 20 minutes, and then we said, now do you want to take over? So we sort of structured, we had an explicit ask. We said, do you want to take over the next 20 minutes? And 55% of parents took over the next 20 minutes. So they sort of, at first weren't sure they wanted to do it, but once it happened, they said, oh, I can do this now. I can take it over. So kind of a seeing is believing approach. And so we're excited to see and tinker with more of these. What is meaningful parental engagement and how do you increase it? But this, of course, would be a place where it would be great to get sort of a ambition in the policy framework. Post-pandemic. It's a tough phrase. What does it even mean to be post-pandemic, right? There's still kind of ongoing things happening. But what I will say is I think we have learned some things that can be taken forward. So I mentioned this point of school disruption. It really is common. I mean, it's kind of amazing. I mean, at the simplest level, vacations and breaks from school. A lot of learning is lost, actually, during these breaks, especially for households at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. This has been documented before COVID. The summer slide, or so finding ways to support education, not just in that physical building, is really key. Actually, even during one of our studies in the Philippines and some countries in Asia, this is a more common challenge. There was a typhoon, so actually there was another disruption. It wasn't just the COVID disruption. And we've actually been documenting disruption. We're actually building a database around school disruption. It's amazingly common, actually. And learning losses that happen just in a few weeks can accumulate into a lifetime of learning loss. Because if you fall behind the curriculum, you might never catch up. And so actually these can be really devastating and finding ways to support it. In terms of can these approaches be used when school is in session, perhaps actually also. And so even some of these studies happened even as the schools reopened. But it was a way to really target that instruction to the individual child. And so we see that the lowest performers who are struggling in that classroom, they really loved getting this phone call. And this could be extended to other approaches. So it would be hard to do for every single child in the system, I think. And so perhaps a better way of thinking about it in the school is for those students who need the most support. And maybe it's the 5% or 10% or 20% of the class. But I think there's ways of thinking about this. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, and I'll start first with a comment in the back about clearly defining what we want from parental involvement. And I think some of us have seen this on LinkedIn. There are different variations of this poster, but it usually says, this is what I learned in school, and this is what I wish I had learned in school. And I think they're getting worse and worse, those posters, right? So there's things in there about emotional well-being, about respect for people and that sort of thing. And so there's arguments about what can we expect children to learn at school and what should we expect them to be learning in the household from their parents, from their caregivers. And so I think it's a really good point you make that we need to be clear about what the expectations are, because maybe some of the other stuff should be learned in the home, and we need to know what that is. And then computers and tablets in schools versus in people's hands, I think certainly given, cell phone penetration, and I think what it does mean a lot of the time, Andile, is access to a cell phone rather than actually ownership of a cell phone. So I do think we need to prioritize, the device in people's hands. And then in terms of opportunities to partner to accelerate program implementation, I think it just takes me back to yesterday and Muriel's statements around business as usual is not going to cut it. And the call to action was all hands on deck. So partnerships beyond the traditional partnerships that we know with international aid, with the big nonprofits, with all of us in the room, needs to expand outside of that to the smaller players as well. And then Mpumi about Edtech, better for early or later grades. I think it can be for both, but in the early grades it needs to be fun and gamified and colorful, and then in the later grades, of course, it needs to be, because it's subject content, tutoring related. So I think it can work in both contexts, and we do need some of these early grade ones in home language. I think maybe this is a challenge to someone who might not be in the room, but maybe on the online space. That's it. Thanks.
Martin?
Thanks. On what can be done in the home and on guiding parents, we have had some initiatives, government-run initiatives, which have targeted private cell phones, in particular in supporting grade 12 exam candidates, but we don't have much work in this area. There is a key risk that one has to take into account, and that is that even if 80% of households or even learners have access to, say, a smartphone, the 20% who don't will be the poorest. So any government initiative that uses that technology is going to run into very serious problems, especially in South Africa where civil society can litigate. And and in principle, it's an unequal intervention. Maybe the solution is for government to provide the 20% poorest with smartphones, but one needs to keep in mind these complexities. Working within the school system is far less complex. It is complex, but there it's easier to address the equity issues. So I think one does need to keep that in mind. There are obviously key advantages with working through schools, and but on the issue of parents, I think, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but and this is in relation to what can parents do. I think what we have done in RCTs in South Africa is look at interventions where parents are helped in providing guidance to their children in areas such as reading. And that's interesting and good. But what I don't think has happened in South Africa is piloting or testing an intervention where parents are given those tools that can tell them how well or how poorly their children read, to then see what is the effect on the school management and the school governance. Do parents hold schools accountable? Do parents bring this up at schools? I mean, I personally was helping somebody, a parent who specifically had this issue. I don't think my teacher is teaching my child to read properly. And I thought, okay, let me get something so that this parent can can test their child at home. I looked online. It's not easy to find useful tools that parents can use. So I think one of the opportunities, low-hanging fruits, as Presidency likes to say, is to make these kinds of, to make sure we have good tools and make them widely available and advocate their use by parents. And that could very easily be slotted into one of the existing campaigns. Then in terms of, what schools can do, thanks for bringing up Presidency's commitment to the tablets. Yeah, so many of us have forgotten about it. There's no money behind it. It kind of trickled into the sand a bit. I think that practical issues such as how do schools themselves see technology becoming accessible to learners is important. I still think that there's this key elephant in the room, which is, does one go for computer labs? Does one go for devices in the hands of learners? And we haven't really addressed that question. I mean, I'm not an expert at this, but my perception is that if you ask schools, they'll say, give me a lab, because anything else is just going to be impractical in terms of recharging of devices, in terms of security, theft, and so on. So one does need to, I think, list, and that's what we need a strategy for. I mean, I'd say the most important point I'd like to make is that we still need a good, informed strategy. Phakisa has a lot of the kind of ambitions, but it's not a costed strategy. It's not widely adopted. In a way, I think it's still a wish list. And then my last comment on I think there was a question around how worrying it is that there's all these different statistics around the impacts of the pandemic and NIDS-CRAM and what the Department of Basic Education has been saying. It's been a confusing period. I mean, NIDS-CRAM was an excellent initiative, but it was done very quickly. The sample was very small. There were some problems with the questionnaires. We would have been in a much better position had government's attendance monitoring been properly in place right from the start of the pandemic. And one of the things I think we've learned is that we do need that. We are now using attendance data which we did not use before the pandemic. So that's one of the benefits of the pandemic. We are now looking at attendance, and we are better kind of prepared should we have another similar crisis. We know how to use that data, and we wouldn't need to use a household survey in order to understand something that we as a system should have our fingers on anyway. Thanks.
Great. Let me quickly respond to the two online ones. Firstly, the one about, are we open to doing more research on parent involvement as the DBE's research team, I guess. I see some people shaking their heads, but I'm going to anyway say, sure, we're open to it. But obviously, we have some, I mean, there's capacity constraints, and we wanted to do more work on ECD and grade R and maths. So we've obviously done a lot around reading. And the work is not finished by any means there either. So definitely open to it. And then linking to Martin's point about are there tools available for parents to use to assess their children's reading performance? And I think you're right. I don't think there are really any widely available ones. And a few years ago, the DBE, we were involved in piloting some scorecards and things. We called it Informed and Empowered was the name of our little project. And unfortunately, it ran into some dead ends and didn't really take off. But I wonder if something like that could be restarted now that we've done the reading benchmarking work and we have a few more maybe easily communicated ideas. Not only easily communicated, but kind of scientifically informed for the different languages around where your children should be on these relatively concrete outcomes. So maybe it's worth thinking about that. Then there was just a question of clarification about what is EGRS, what is EGRP. So EGRS, the Early Grade Reading Study, was initially the name of EGRS 1 in the Northwest Province, and it's kind of now we're using it. We use it then for EGRS 2. EGRP is more, that's Early Grade Reading Program, and that's what we are doing currently in the Northwest Province, which is a type of scale-up. We're scaling up what we've done in the Northwest Province, so we've covered a lot more schools compared to the initial RCT. Although there is still a research component to that, where as much as all schools in the Ruth-Segemoto-Mompati district are getting the base program of some training, lesson plans, LTSM, that all the schools are getting that. But then there are some schools getting on-site coaching and some schools getting departmental head-led coaching. So we are still doing a research component to test the relative impacts of those coaching models. But we rather wanted to call it Early Grade Reading Program in line with the President's commitment to expand an early grade reading program of lesson plans, integrated reading materials, and professional support to teachers, because we're wanting it to not just be seen as like a study. I think sometimes people think a study doesn't involve intervening in schools, it doesn't involve programs, it's just kind of like looking at some data and things like that. So that's partly why we called it the early grade reading program. I would like to, let me just see if, I know Ursula had a hand up, so let me just take Ursula and then just the response to Ursula's question, because we are over time, but I didn't want to discriminate against the right-hand side, and there was that one hand over there. So Ursula, if you could ask your question, we'll respond and then close the session.
So it's a little bit more of a comment than a question, but I think it's just to come in again on Martin's point about a strategy. And I think that really what's needed is a strategy that also differentiates between different levels. So there's the administrative level, there's the pedagogical level in the conventional classroom, and then there's the out-of-school context. And I think that different decisions can be made at those different